Hello, English 2 Pre-AP students. It's Mr. Brissman. This is a little bit of DirectTeach for 8/27/2020. That should be Thursday. Today we're talking about grammar and grammar review. This week we've been working with commas and a few of commas, what they can do. Obviously, if you went through this week's activities, you noticed one of the things commas are supposed to do is separate items in a series. Our very first one that we've got here says, I like to jump, comma, jive, comma, and wail. In this case, we have 3 words, 3 actions, and we have to separate them off. This comma is necessary for clarity. It's called an Oxford comma when you put it in the series before the word and. There are some situations where this comma isn't needed for clarity, but when you want to make sure that we understand that jive is a separate action from wail rather than jive and wail being a single thing, the comma helps separate these as separate items. The next one down, please bring a sack of potatoes, 2 yellow onions, and 5 pounds of ground beef. Obviously, item 1, a sack of potatoes. Item 2, 2 yellow onions. Now I say item even though it's 2 of them, but that is the second thing in our list. Once again, we have an Oxford comma that helps set off the third part for clarity. Our third one moves on to a different comma rule where we have an introductory element. In this case, as I glanced up into the sky, comma, a shooting star flew across the horizon. If you've been struggling with how do I know when and when not to include a comma after an introductory element, what does the element have to look like? It's important for us to go way back in grammar to remember just a couple things. Sentences have to have a subject and they have to have a verb. If they don't have those 2 things, they can't be a sentence. They also have to have a complete thought in some way. So in this case, the subject of our sentence is star. And the thing that it did is flew. That's the verb. So star flew. Everything else is kind of extra. As I glanced up into the sky appears to have a subject, I, and it appears to have a verb, glanced, but the word as changed all of this. As I glanced up into the sky, when I say that, it doesn't complete the thought. There has to be something else to make this make complete sense. As you glanced up into the sky, what? If there's still a question as to what's coming next, because they've signified it with a word like this, then what you're really looking at is now a dependent clause. If it stands on its own, a shooting star flew across the horizon, that's an independent clause. Independent means it can stand alone. If it has subject and verb but can't stand alone, that's called a dependent clause. And this dependent introductory clause has to be set off with a comma for clarity's sake. We have a similar thing happening in the next sentence. When you get home, call your mother. You is a subject word, get is a verb, so subject, verb, but the word when makes this a dependent clause. This part, when you get home, depends on the rest of it to make sense. The second part is a command, call your mother. This is a little bit tricky because you're like, well, where's the subject of the second part of the sentence, Mr. Brissman? Anything that is a command, we sometimes call it an imperative, I-M-P-E-R-A-T-I-V-E, if I got that right. Imperatives are commands. If I say stop, what I'm really saying is you stop. If I say call your mother, I really am saying you call your mother. It has an implied subject in the second part of the sentence. So if that's ever been confusing you, now you have an amazing answer. Our third thing that we got going on here for comma usage. Before we go any further, comma, Mrs. McDermott said, comma, I need to know if you've remembered to bring your passport. If you've noticed, we have the same thing going on here that we did up above, where this needs to have a comma, if nothing else, because we had an introductory dependent clause. However, in this case, we've also broken it up with Mrs. McDermott said in the middle. Where do the commas go when you have quotations? The biggest thing to note is they always are going to go inside the quotation marks. We ended or paused this thought, ended the quotation mark. We brought in Mrs. McDermott said, we ended that thought before we started the new quotation mark. You wouldn't want to move this comma inside. That would be ugly and weird. You've probably noticed this if you've been reading over the years, that this is kind of where commas tend to go. These rules that I just showed you here are directly quizzed on Friday's quiz. I hope this made some sense to you. If you looked at it on Thursday and it doesn't make sense to you, jump on a Teams meeting and we can talk about it before you take your quiz on Friday. You can either jump on the Thursday Teams or the Friday Teams, and hopefully either one will help you. Also, if you're wondering and you've listened to this far, my favorite number is 42.